I have a statement, and then we'll be happy to answer a few questions. Today, Judge Bachman has affirmed our position that Johnson & Johnson, motivated by greed and avarice, is responsible for the opioid epidemic in our state. Johnson & Johnson will finally be held accountable for thousands of deaths and addiction caused by their activities. Throughout the trial, our team proved what we have alleged all along, that the company used pseudoscience and misleading information that downplayed the risks of opioids, leading to the worst man-made public nuisance our state and this country has ever seen, the opioid crisis. As a result, when opioid sales in Oklahoma began to skyrocket, the death toll from unintentional prescription drug-related overdoses mounted, leaving in its wake broken homes, families, and communities. We showed how the company repeatedly ignored warnings by the federal government and its own scientific advisors about the dangers of its drugs and the risks of marketing its products in the way it did. The company promoted its products through unbranded campaigns by funding front groups and many patient groups meant to look like grassroots organizations that spread the company's misinformation. We have proven that Johnson & Johnson built its billion-dollar brand out of greed and on the backs of pain and suffering of innocent people. Although we showed the way Johnson & Johnson created the epidemic, we also showed the brilliant work of those in the state who've been serving on the front lines. These are individuals at agencies like the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, led by Commissioner Terry White, Tom Bates and his team at the Department of Health, and at the OSU Center for Wellness and Recovery, led by Drs. Casey Schrum, Jason Beeman, and Julie Croft. These people I just named and the countless others who I didn't are heroes. It is safe to say that without them, there would be thousands more dead, and even more would still be in the clutches of addiction. At this trial, we heard from national experts like Dr. Andrew Kolodny, who is regarded as the nation's foremost expert on the opioid epidemic in the U.S. He demonstrated how Johnson & Johnson took data out of context with respect to their branded opioids, minimized safety issues related to those opioids, omitted material information related to the safety of their opioids, and made comparative efficiency claims about their opioids without substantial evidence. And possibly the most significant and heart-rending part of our trial was when we gave the world a glimpse of what victims of the epidemic look like. Christy Hughes and John McGregor nearly lost everything to their addictions, and they were the lucky ones. They lived to tell their stories. Because in our state there are countless families, like the family of OU football star Austin Box. His parents, Craig and Gail, go to bed every night and wake up every morning to the insufferable reality of knowing they will never see their beautiful son, Austin, again. And because Johnson & Johnson targeted pregnant women in our state, we also heard from the executive director of Pepper's Ranch, Tanya Ratcliffe, who discussed what it's like caring for babies born with an addiction to opioids. We saw an actual video of a newborn shaking uncontrollably as it suffered from the effects of neonatal abstinence syndrome. From the minute these babies draw their first breath, their lives are negatively impacted and perhaps will never be the same. Regrettably, we can't change the past. We can never bring back those who lost their lives because Johnson & Johnson executives made the calculated and cold-blooded decision that they were going to produce a mutant strain of poppy, corner the market, and supply massive amounts of the active ingredients for other companies to manufacture opioids around the nation and in Oklahoma. The family members who still struggle with the loss of a loved one will remain the victims devastated by this corporate greed forever. I know personally and have met with and spoken to families of those whose loved ones have been erased by an opioid overdose. Words will never be enough to take their pain away. I do, however, hope that today Judge Bachman's decision will provide some solace to the thousands of families who have tragically lost a loved one due to an opioid overdose. And today should also inspire a sense of optimism to those struggling with an opioid addiction, because we are committed to getting you the help you need to reclaim your life and your future. It has taken over 2 years for us to get here. There have no doubt been some bumps along the way. We suffered through attacks and obstacles, moments of trepidation and worry, but also moments of hope, and today, great triumph. Through it all, this incredible team has stuck together. And I want to say it took tremendous courage from this team of highly skilled attorneys. These are attorneys who've suffered greatly, not just during this case, being away from their families and not taking on other work, but many on this team have lost loved ones to addiction at the hands of these deadly drugs. They know firsthand the anguish of burying a family member who they first had to watch spiral into despair. Judge Mike Burridge, his law partner Reggie Witten, and everyone at Witten Burridge, Brad Beckworth and his team at Nix Patterson, and also from my office, First Assistant Don Cash, General Counsel Abby Dilsaver, the many assistant AGs, paralegals, and support staff, put in just as much time and effort as everybody who was in court these last 7 weeks. We persevered. We did so because we knew that in the end, we were going to be on the right side of history. We will look back on this dark period and know that we stood up for Oklahomans to take on Goliath. It has not been easy, but it has been well worth it. Finally, just as we've said several times at different stages of this case, when Johnson & Johnson pulled out all stops to try to derail and stall the case, we appreciate Judge Bachman's wisdom and openness. He clearly saw through all the company's desperate acts to delay justice for Oklahomans. In closing, what we showed during our 7-week trial and what Judge Bachman confirmed today is what we know now for certain. Johnson & Johnson was the kingpin behind the nation's ongoing opioid crisis. And I have a message for the CEO of Johnson & Johnson. On Monday of last week, the Business Roundtable, a group that represents CEOs of big corporations, declared that it had changed its mind about the purpose of corporations. That purpose is no longer to maximize profits for shareholders, but to benefit other stakeholders as well, including employees, customers, and citizens. Johnson & Johnson is a member of the Business Roundtable, and I'm asking the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, Alex Gorsky, to put his money where his mouth is and get out his checkbook. Happy to answer any questions. Question over here and then here.
Are you disappointed at all in the $572 million?
Well, Robert Browning once said, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? So we took the position that given all the scientific review, all the expert consultation that we did with folks like Terry and her team, with addiction scientists in the state and around the country, that given the potential for folks to relapse and given the extent of the epidemic, dealing with it comprehensively was something that we felt was the most responsible way to address this. So we gave the judge a 20-year plan, a 30-year plan. Again, that was designed to ensure that we were dealing with everything that this defendant caused. So what we have is cumulatively, from the other defendants in this case. We've been able to put together almost $1 billion to help people in the state deal with the consequences of their actions. And we're very proud to be where we are today. The judge's order, as we've reviewed it, is very clear with respect to the actions of the defendant and its culpability with regard to the epidemic in the state. Question over here, then here. Question over here.
Could you explain, so it's for what, you were asking for 17 billion. This was 572 million. The judge said 1 year. Do you go back to the judge and ask for more, or to the legislature, as the judge said this would be addressed by the legislature?
Well, it's a 40-plus page opinion. We have speed readers on our team, but they don't read that fast. So we're going to spend some time looking at the opinion. I've already started meetings with leadership of the legislature and the governor. So there's going to be a united front with regard to how we proceed with this. It's going to be an important step forward in dealing with the epidemic. You know, certainly we would have liked to walk out of here with $17.5 billion, $17 billion and change. But realistically, we've been able, again, to put together almost $1 billion to help Oklahoma work its way through. Question here and then right there.
Other states are watching this case because they have pending litigation against these pharmaceutical companies. In your mind, is this a day of reckoning for pharmaceutical companies? Yes, absolutely.
There's no question about it. And the record that's now available to my colleagues in other states is certainly something that's going to assist this process around the country. There is no question in my mind that we had to bring this case, that it had to be tried, that these facts had to see sunlight. That's been accomplished here. And at the end of the day, you can't sit in a corporate suite somewhere for the last 20 years and oversupply the country. 10 times more of this drug was coming in, and then you had, concomitantly, 15 times more people dying from opioid overdoses. So there's no question in my mind that these companies knew what was going on at the highest level. They just couldn't quit making money from it, and that's why they're responsible.
What does it mean to Austin Box's parents stood outside and were crying and just talking about how this is such a win for Oklahoma today? They credited you all, the entire team, with really going up against this David and Goliath battle, honestly. And we know that all eyes are on the state today, as evidence here today, and Ohio has suits coming up this fall. West Virginia probably suits last week. What does it mean to you to hear these families in tears with gratitude about this battle? And I also have a question for Reggie as well.
So one of the things that's important about the job that I have and the job that these gentlemen have assisted me in doing the last 7 weeks is I've got an oath of office to the people of the state, the 4 million people of the state, and they all have families and friends. They all have things that are important to them. And if you ever get to the point, as I believe happened in these corporate suites, where you're looking at people as data points, where you're looking at all this death and destruction as a cost of doing business that you don't have to incur, if you ever get to that point, you really ought to be ashamed of yourself. And again, that's why I'm asking the CEO of Johnson & Johnson to step up, put his money where his mouth is, get this judgment paid so that we can start helping Oklahomans. The boxes were a continuing inspiration to us. And for those of you who've got young people who've gotten injured and they've been given painkillers, you're lucky. Because you never know. You might be in that 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 universe of people who's got a vulnerability to addiction. You don't know it. It's part of your physiology. And that's another big part of this. They didn't know. There's never been any authoritative studies that determine the extent to which you can become addicted to a prescription opioid. But they didn't care. So specifically, Austin and Gail have been inspirations to us. And every time I think about Austin, and I know a lot of us feel that way, you know, we think about our children.
Reggie, what does it mean, and so many people don't realize, watching on the national stage, that you have such a personal impact. What does this day mean for you and your loved ones? I saw your wife in the courtroom and a lot of members of your family. Tell us a little bit about what this day means for you.
Let's Now come around here, Reggie.
It's a pretty hard question to answer. I'll try. I feel like my boy's looking down, and it's a pretty tough deal. But I think my son and Austin are celebrating today, and we got to get help to these other kids. So I'm very grateful for the court for what he did, and depends on what these other companies do now. Am I optimistic? No, I'm not. I think they'll appeal this thing and fight till hell freezes over. But my boy and Austin are fighters, and we are too.
What's your message to other families? You and your wife and the Boxes were very brave to talk about opioid and opioid addiction when so many people were not talking about it. I mean, you said to me that, no one was talking about it at the time.
No.
What's your message to families out there that have loved ones dealing with this tonight?
It's hard because you love your kids, and you're looking at the worst thing they ever did in their whole life. And that's all people judge them by. Austin was a good boy, and my son was a good boy. They got sick, and we didn't know what to do. I know what caused it now, and I plan on fighting it in some form or fashion the rest of my life. But anyway, I'm still here, and I'm gonna keep fighting. Thank you.
General Hunter, what's next for that money that the judge has ordered? I know he went through a list of what it could pay for. The legislature actually makes those decisions, and then also how much that goes to the fund.
Well, I've said all along that on the back end of this, there's going to have to be implementing legislation. So next steps are something that we're going to have to work through, again, with the state's leaders. But going forward, the judge left open, I guess, the strong possibility. In fact, I think he forecasted that there are going to be subsequent orders that will clarify and implement the opinion. So those are all things that we're going to have to work through over the coming days and weeks. Somebody else. Castile.
Your decision to narrow this case down to just public nuisance, do you see that now as the right call?
No question about it.
Could the state have gotten more money, though, if it had proven fraud in this case?
In our judgment, the best way to proceed, the complexity of the other claims in our case, we evaluated carefully. We also, again, we're looking towards what do we need to do to address not only the present but the future. And so as we looked at public nuisance law, it was clear to us that that's the best way to maximize any kind of a judgment that we were able to obtain in court here. And so, no looking back, we made the right decision. I'm confident, Chris. Thanks.
The percentage of this judgment that will go for to offset legal costs, fees, what will that be?
So my understanding of where we are in the contract is if we're able to finalize this judgment, get it collected, if Gorski writes a check, there'll be most of this is going to be subject to a single-digit retainer on the part of the team. There's a small part of it that will be, I think, just over 10%. Other questions? Over here.
Mr. Attorney General, you had no distributors or retail pharmacy chains in your lawsuit. Given the outcome, would the state consider suing any additional parts of the pharmaceutical?
Everything's on the table. Other questions? Back here and then over here.
Just curious, do y'all think Johnson & Johnson's attorneys underestimated you guys? That they were just going to come in here and steamroll you?
Brad, you want to talk about that?
Sure. This little group's been underestimated our whole lives. And what a lot of y'all don't know is the team behind you that helps support us has, truthfully, for 2 years, lived in an office. Many people lived on mattresses in Judge Burridge's office, including myself. And we've all had personal losses, nothing like Reggie's, but real ones. And a lot of difficulty along the way. At every turn, J&J has been a company of what I can only call institutional arrogance. They have called our claims baseless. They have laughed at Commissioner White more than once, who, if you guys don't know, is the longest serving commissioner of mental health in this entire country. And everyone out there should look at what she did in her career before this case and also in the abatement plan that she and our team put together, because it is a map of what needs to happen in this country. They've underestimated General Hunter. You guys probably know that they have run everything they could at him. And even during this trial, when we had proven that these drugs are, in their own experts' words, up to 25% addictive, and that 1 in 15 people will turn to heroin after prescription drug use, even after their own corporate representatives said that they have never done the testing to tell you whether when your child is prescribed one of their drugs, they will become an addict and die. They sat in that chair, in that witness stand, and said they had zero responsibility for this crisis. And today, for the first time in Oklahoma history and in this entire country, due to the leadership of this man and the help of this woman, we know that the root of this entire crisis began in Tasmania and New Jersey with Johnson & Johnson. And they can't laugh anymore. They can't call this case baseless anymore. And they had 100 lawyers working against a team of 13 and the Attorney General's staff, who has a lot of jobs. And we beat them at every turn, including today. So I don't know, Wayne, if that answers your question, but these two guys and us have never backed down.
One more question.
Randy Ellis down here, Bob, and then maybe just one more after that.
I'm interested in knowing from Terry White what you think he can do with nearly $1 billion.
Go ahead, Terry.
So if you look at this being a one-year judgment with $1 billion, just taking the $572 million by itself for 1 year, knowing that it's 1 year, 20 years, right? We're talking $11 billion. 30 years, as we think it will take to abate the crisis, we're talking $15 billion. I think we are right
averted, rarely abused, and they amounted to less than 1% of all opioid prescriptions prescribed to patients in Oklahoma. That's true throughout the country as well. And at trial, you will remember, there was not a single Oklahoma patient or family member who testified about abuse or misuse of any Johnson & Johnson medicine. And you'll remember that the state never called a single doctor, a single Oklahoma doctor, to testify that they were misled by anything that the company said or did. Today's decision reflects a radical departure from more than a century of case law in this state. For over 100 years, public nuisance law has been limited to property disputes, where one misuses their property and causes harm to another. That is not what this case is about. No Oklahoma court has ever done what this court has done today in applying public nuisance law to any commercial activity, let alone the highly regulated area of prescription medicines. The decision violates well-established constitutional principles, including due process of law. And at bottom, the decision is fundamentally unfair in that it finds Johnson & Johnson responsible for the entirety of the opioid abuse crisis and the greater drug problems in this state, while there was no evidence at trial to support that finding. We will be preparing our appellate papers promptly, and we look forward to presenting these issues to the Oklahoma Supreme Court.
Questions? Go ahead.
Sean Murphy with the AP. It seems like one of the arguments that the judge gave some credit to was the idea that Johnson & Johnson's subsidiaries provided the raw materials used by other manufacturers to make opioid drugs. Could you address that?
Yes, I think that's one of the examples of the problem with the decision that we see today. There's no basis, either factually or as a matter of law, for any liability associated with Johnson & Johnson's former subsidiaries who manufactured raw materials for opioid medications. The evidence is that those companies were one of many who manufactured raw materials for opioid medicines, and that every aspect of that business is highly regulated by the DEA and FDA. Every gram of raw material that is manufactured is done so pursuant to DEA quotas. Every manufacturer who buys raw material from those companies must do so consistent with quotas that they receive from the DEA. And there was no evidence at trial. The state did not put on any evidence that there was any wrongdoing by those companies.
In the back right there.
Ms. Strong, the defense said several times throughout the trial that obviously there were two other companies initially named that settled, and that Johnson & Johnson would never have brought this to trial if they didn't feel that they were right in doing what they were doing. Do you guys have any regrets at this point, knowing now that you're being ordered to pay more money than either of the other two companies settled for?
Listen, I think Larry Ottaway said it best in opening statement, and you just referenced it. When you're right, you fight. And that's precisely what you're seeing here. The company here made medicines that are essential for patients who suffer from debilitating harm. That's what they did. They did it responsibly. They did it carefully. If you were here and listened to the evidence of the trial and you listened to the people of the company who testified, you understand that this is a company that cares about patients, and that everything they did with respect to how they manufactured these drugs was responsible. In fact, you may recall the testimony about their medication that was introduced in 2011 a brand new molecule, something that had never been available to patients before, as a new, maybe better alternative for patients who suffer from harm. They didn't produce that medication onto the market until it was in a crush-resistant formula. That's a responsible company. That's who we want making these types of medications, responsible companies who are out there to try to help patients, and that's what we see in Johnson & Johnson.
Go ahead.
Jackie Fortier, NPR. What does this verdict do for public nuisance law in the United States?
Well, this is Oklahoma, and it's under state law in Oklahoma, and we think it's an absolute misapplication of Oklahoma law, and that will be something that will be raised in the appellate papers. I don't think it says anything about what will happen elsewhere in the country. I think it's an absolute outlier, and other courts have already rejected the theory in other jurisdictions, and we expect that this is something that will be addressed by the Court of Appeal.
Go ahead. Who are you?
Oh, sorry, Lenny Burton, Washington Post. On the abatement, are you reading that as an annual payment that the judge is assigning to Johnson & Johnson, or a one-shot?
We all just got the decision. My understanding from the comments on the bench is that is the amount that the judge has ordered, a singular amount, and that anything beyond that, I believe his statements were, that it would be left to the legislature. But as I said before, there's no basis for that one-time amount.
Go ahead.
Caroline Coulter, KGOU. If you lose at the state Supreme Court, will you take it to the federal level?
I'm really trying not to get ahead of things here, and our focus immediately will be on the appellate papers for the Oklahoma Supreme Court. But I think it's fair to say, as you heard me reference, there are some serious constitutional problems with the decision today, and we do believe that these are issues that will be of interest to the United States Supreme Court if necessary.
Adam Troxton on the transcript said this is not the only type of these lawsuits that Johnson & Johnson is involved in. Given the result of this case, do you foresee any change in tactics in other areas, the way that you attack this case, a similar case in a different state? Is that going to change at all, or are you confident in the way it's handled here?
As I said, I believe this case is unique. We are here under Oklahoma law. The other cases that are pending and that are at the forefront are not in Oklahoma and will be litigated under different law with different circumstances. So, no, I don't believe that will change anything in that regard.
Go ahead.
You all had called the state's case flimsy as recently as just a few weeks ago, and today still you're saying after the judgment that you do not believe Johnson & Johnson bears any responsibility. Who would you say is responsible? If it's not Johnson & Johnson, you don't believe the company has any responsibility whatsoever?
That's right. The Oklahoma and I think the nation's opioid abuse crisis is a serious public health issue. Nobody disputes that. But you can't sue your way out of the opioid abuse crisis. This is a problem that faces the country that must be addressed by public and private partnerships, by all stakeholders. Everyone must come together to address this. Litigation is not the answer, and as we saw at trial, Johnson & Johnson did not cause the opioid abuse crisis. The crisis, although it includes some diversion of prescription medications, it's largely driven by illegally manufactured drugs that are coming into the country from Mexico and elsewhere. These are problems that need to be addressed outside of the litigation context.
So you don't think that any of the drug companies are responsible?
Look, the defendants in this case are my clients, Johnson & Johnson and Janssen. That's what this case is about, and I think the evidence makes plain that my clients are not responsible and did not cause the opioid abuse crisis in this state.
I know that everybody's in deadline, so let's take two more. Go ahead, and could you identify yourself, please?
Stephanie Becker, CNN. This was a really emotional issue in Oklahoma. Do you think that might have had an effect on the judge's ruling?
Look, I think this is an emotional issue across the board. Substance abuse and the opioid abuse crisis is a major public health problem. But that doesn't change the facts of what we're dealing with here, which is the question is, did Johnson & Johnson cause the opioid crisis in Oklahoma? And the answer to that is plainly no.
Final question?
Chris Castillo with the Oklahoma. That's not really an argument you can make to the Supreme Court, though, right? I mean, you can't retry all these sides before them, so you're going to attack the public nuisance and First Amendment and what else, maybe?
I think there are going to be a lot of issues that we're going to see in the appellate papers that are going to be put together. They will include issues of law and issues of fact.
What are the constitutional issues?
There are many constitutional issues, including due process of law. The fact that Oklahoma has never utilized public nuisance law in this way before, that it has never been applied outside of the property context, that it has never been applied to commercial activity before, that is a fundamental due process concern. The fact that the judge believes that it's appropriate to hold a company who had less than 1% of the market responsible for the entirety of the opioid abuse crisis, including illicitly manufactured drugs imported into this country by drug traffickers, that's a fundamental due process problem, as just a couple examples.
Thank you, and we'll be around, so if there are other questions, contact, there are a number of people here from Johnson & Johnson. Contact us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.